But I'm just so thrilled with my little filming studio here. I'm not showing off. Yeah, I am. I have the best daughters. Looky here, manager. Your mom started all this cleaning up. And then Hannah Banana has helped in here. Of course, your mom started in here too. Phew. Okay. I have my teeth in tonight. How about that? Sorry about that last night. Sorry about the crazy effects, but I thought it helped hide my granny look. Am I too far away? Ugh. Okay, sorry that it took forever on my live chat a while ago to come up. And folks that don't get notifications, I know you don't. That's why. I mean, it's not me. It's YouTube, I reckon. Because there's nothing for me that I've seen that says send out notifications. That's why I went to having my live at 5 on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays at 5 Eastern time. And yeah, I know today I was late. Thank you, Donna Mako, once again, for pinging me on my phone and saying, it's 5 o'clock. Hannah and I were just working on here. Lost track of time. Here we go. And one more thing. I am not trying to copy Fiber Spider. I love Craig, and he does a great job of reading, better than I do. So if y'all want to watch him, I'm totally cool with that. I mean, he was doing it way before I was. I didn't realize he was reading The Secret Garden also. As a matter of fact, I thought he already had, but he is reading it too, and probably doing a much better job. But anywho, I just want to say, I love Craig, love Fiber Spider. Here we go. Chapter 5, The Cry in the Corridor. At first, each day which passed by for Mary Lennox was exactly like the others. Every morning she awoke in her tapestried room and found Martha kneeling upon the hearth, building her fire. Every morning she ate her breakfast in the nursery, which had nothing amusing in it. And after breakfast, she gazed out of the window across to the huge moor, which seemed to spread out on all sides and climb up to the sky. And after she had stared for a while, she realized that if she did not go out, she would not have to stay. If she did not go out, she would have to stay in and do nothing, and so she went out. Okay, so she went out. She did not know that this was the best thing she could have done. And she did not know that when she began to walk quickly or even run along the paths and down the avenue, she was stirring her slow blood and making herself stronger by fighting with the wind which swept down from the moor. She ran only to make herself warm. Excuse me. And she hated the wind which rushed at her face and roared and held her back as if it were some giant she could not see. But the big breaths of rough, fresh air blown over the heather filled her lungs with something which was good for her whole thin body, and whipped some red color into her cheeks, and brightened her dull eyes when she did not know anything about it. But after a few days spent almost entirely out of doors, she wakened one morning knowing what it was to be hungry. And when she sat down at her breakfast, she did not glance disdainfully at her porridge and push it away, but took up her spoon and began to eat it, and went on eating it until her bowl was empty. "I got on well with that this morning, didn't I?" said Martha. "It tastes nice today," said Mary, feeling a little surprised at herself. It's the air of the moor that's given thee stomach for thy victuals, answered Martha. It's lucky for thee that thou's got victuals as well as appetite. There's been 12 in our cottage as had the stomach and nothing to put in it. You go on playing, you out of doors every day, and you'll get some flesh on your bones, and you won't be so yeller. I don't play, said Mary. I have nothing to play with. Nothing to play with, exclaimed Martha. Our children plays with sticks and stones. I use my fancy dabbing cloth, though I hate to, just 'cause it's so pretty. All the way from England, from Miss Tracy Crochet Rocks. Thank you so much. In my lovely box. I have to show it again, sorry. Here I am in the middle of things. Full of squirrel stitch markers. Let's see. Nothing to play at. They just runs around and shouts and looks at things. Mary did not shout, but she looked at things. There was nothing else to do. She walked round and round the gardens and wondered about the paths in the park. Sometimes she looked for Ben Weatherstaff, but though several times she saw him at work, he was too busy to look at her or was too surly. Once when she was walking toward him, he picked up his spade and turned away as if he did it on purpose. One day she went to one place she went to oftener than to any other. It was the long walk outside the gardens with the walls round them. There were bare flower beds on either side of it, and against the walls ivy grew thickly. There was one part of the wall where the creeping dark green leaves were more bushy than elsewhere. It seemed as if for a long time that part had been neglected. The rest of it had been clipped and made to look neat, but at this lower end of the walk it had not been trimmed at all. A few days after she had talked to Ben Weatherstaff, Mary stopped to notice this and wondered why it was so. She had just paused and was looking up at a long spray of ivy swinging in the wind when she saw a gleam of scarlet and heard a brilliant chirp. And there on the top of the wall, forward perched Ben Weatherstaff's Robin Redbreast, tilting forward to look at her with his small head on one side. "Oh," she cried out, "is it you? Is it you?" And it did not seem at all queer to her that she spoke to him, as if she were sure that he would understand and answer her. He did answer. He twittered and chirped and hopped along the wall as if he were telling her all sorts of things. It seemed to Mistress Mary as if she understood him too. Though he was not speaking in words, it was as if he said, "Good morning. Isn't the wind nice? Isn't the sun nice? Isn't everything nice? Let us both chirp and hop and twitter. Come on, come on." Mary began to laugh. And as he hopped and took little flights along the wall, she ran after him. Poor little thin, sallow, ugly Mary. She actually looked almost pretty for a moment. I like you, she cried out. Pattering down the walk, and she chirped and tried to whistle, which last she did not know how to do in the least. But the robin seemed to be quite satisfied and chirped and whistled back at her. At last he spread his wings and made a darting flight to the top of the tree where he perched and sang loudly. That reminded Mary of the first time she had seen him. He had been swinging on a treetop then, and she'd been standing in the orchard. Now she was on the other side of the orchard and standing in the path outside a wall much lower down, and there was the same tree inside. "It's in the garden no one can go into," she said to herself. "It's the garden without a door. He lives in there. How I wish I could see what it's like." She ran up the walk to the green door she had entered the first morning. Then she ran down the path through the other door and then into the orchard. And when she stood and looked up, there was the tree on the other side of the wall, and there was the robin just finishing his song and beginning to preen his feathers with his beak. "It is the garden," she said. "I'm sure it is." She walked around and looked closely at that side of the orchard wall, but she only found what she had found, got some fibers there before, but there was no door in it. Then she ran through the kitchen gardens again and out into the walk outside the long ivy-covered wall, and she walked to the end of it and looked at it, but there was no door. And then she walked to the other end, looking again, but there was no door. "It's very queer," she said. "Ben Weatherstaff said there was no door, and there is no door. But there must have been one 10 years ago because Mr. Craven buried the key." This gave her so much to think of that she began to be quite interested and feel that she was not sorry that she had come to Misselthwaite Manor. In India, she had always felt hot and too languid to care much about anything. The fact was that the fresh wind from the moor had begun to blow the cobwebs out of her young brain and to waken her up a little. She stayed out of doors nearly all day, and when she sat down to her supper at night, she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. She did not feel cross when Martha chattered away. She felt as if she rather liked to hear her. And at last, she thought she would ask her a question. She asked it after she had finished her supper and had sat down on the hearth rug before the fire. "Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden?" she said. She had made Martha stay with her, and Martha had not objected at all. She was very young, and she was used to a crowded cottage full of brothers and sisters, and she found it dull in the great servants' hall downstairs, where the footmen and upper housemaids made fun of her Yorkshire speech and looked upon her as a common little thing, and sat and whispered among themselves. Martha liked to talk, and the strange child who had lived in India and been waited upon was a novelty enough to attract her. She sat down on the hearth herself without waiting to be asked. "Art thou thinking about the garden yet?" she said. "I knew thou would. That was just the way with me when I first heard about it." "Why did he hate it?" Mary persisted. Martha tucked her feet under her and made herself quite comfortable. "Listen to the wind wuthering round the house," she said. "You could bear stand up on the moor if you were out on it tonight." Mary did not know what wuthering meant until she listened, and then she understood. It must mean that hollow, shuddering sort of roar which rushed around and around the house, as if the giant no one could see were buffeting it and beating at the walls and windows to try to break in. But one knew he could not get in, and somehow it made one feel very safe and warm inside a room with a red coal fire. "Why did he hate it so?" she asked after she had listened. She intended to know if Martha did. Then Martha gave up her store of knowledge. "Mind," she said. "Mrs. Medlock said it's not to be talked about. There's lots of things in this place that's not to be talked over. That's Mr. Craven's orders. His troubles are none of the servants' business, he says. But for the garden, he wouldn't be like he is. It was Mrs. Craven's garden that she had made when first they were married, and she just loved it. And they used to tend the flowers themselves. And none of the gardeners was ever let to go in. Him and her used to go in and shut the door and stay there for hours and hours, reading and talking, and she was just a bit of a girl, and there was an old tree with a branch bent like a seat on it, and she made roses grow over it as she used to sit there. And she used to sit there. But one day when she was sitting there, the branch broke and she fell on the ground and was hurt so bad that next day she died. The doctors thought he'd go out of his mind and die too. That's why he hates it. No one's never gone in since, and he won't let anyone talk about it. Must have been mighty weak people. Mary did not ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind wuthering. Makes me think of Wuthering Heights. It seemed to be wuthering louder than ever. At that moment, a very good thing was happening to her. 4 good things had happened to her, in fact, since she came to Misselthwaite Manor. She had felt as if she had understood a robin, and that he understood her. She had run in the wind until her blood had grown warm. She had been healthily hungry for the first time in her life, and she found out what it was to be sorry for someone. She was getting on. But as she was listening to the wind, she began to listen to something else. She could not know what it was because at first she could scarcely distinguish it from the wind itself. It was a curious sound. It seemed almost as if a child were crying somewhere. Sometimes the wind sounded rather like a child crying, but presently Mistress Mary felt quite sure this sound was inside the house, not outside it. It was far away, but it was inside. She turned round and looked at Martha. "Do you hear anyone crying?" she said. Martha suddenly looked confused. "No," she answered, "it's the wind. Sometimes it sounds like if someone was lost on the moor and wailing. It's got all sorts of sounds." "But listen," said Mary, "it's in the house, down one of the long corridors." And at that very moment a door must have been opened somewhere downstairs, for a great rushing draught blew along the passage, and the door of the room they sat in was blown open with a crash. And as they both jumped to their feet, the light was blown out, and the crying sound was swept down the far corridor so that it was to be heard more plainly than ever. "There," said Mary, "I told you so." It was someone crying, and it isn't a grown-up person. Martha ran and shut the door and turned the key, but before she did, they both heard the sound of a door in some far passage shutting with a bang, and then everything was quiet, for even the wind ceased wuthering for a few moments. "It was the wind," said Martha stubbornly, "and if it wasn't, it was little Betty Butterworth, the scullery maid. She's had the toothache all day." But something troubled and awkward in her manner made Mistress Mary stare very hard at her. She did not believe she was speaking the truth. And that's the end of chapter 5. And we are at 19 minutes. And let's see how long chapter 6 is. Ooh, chapter 6 is pretty long. But maybe we'll read a little bit of it. How about that? Chapter 6. There was someone crying. There was. The next day the rain poured down in torrents again. And when Mary looked out of her window, the moor was almost hidden by gray mist and cloud. There could be no going out today. "What do you do in your cottage when it rains like this?" she asked Martha. "Try to keep from under each other's feet mostly," Martha answered. There does seem to be a lot of us then. Mother's a good-tempered woman, but she gets fair moithered. Here's a word for you. Moithered. Good-tempered woman, but she gets fair moithered. Maybe aggravated, annoyed. We'll let Michelle check it out for us. The biggest one goes out to the cowshed and plays there. Dickon, he doesn't mind the wet. He goes out just the same as if the sun was shining. He says he sees things on rainy days as doesn't show when it's fair weather. He once found a little fox cub half drowned in its hole, and he brought it home in the bosom of his shirt to keep it warm. Its mother had been killed nearby, and the hole was swum out, and the rest of the litter was dead. So it was flooded. He got it home now. He found a half-drowned young crow another time and brought it home too and tamed it. It's named Soot because it's so black, and it hops and flies about with him everywhere. The time had come when Mary had forgotten to resent Martha's familiar talk. She'd even begun to find it interesting and to be sorry when she stopped or went away. The story she had been told by her ayah when she lived in India had been quite unlike those Martha had to tell about the Moreland cottage, which held 14 people who lived in 4 little rooms and never had quite enough to eat. The children seemed to tumble about and amuse themselves like a litter of rough, good-natured collie puppies. Mary was mostly attracted by the mother and Dickon. When Martha told stories of what, in parentheses, mother said or did, they always sounded comfortable. If I had a raven or a fox cub, I could play with it, said Mary, but I have nothing. Martha looked perplexed. Can thou knit? She asked. Madonna. No, answered Mary. Can thou sew? No. Can thou read? Yes. Then why doesn't thou read something or learn a bit of spelling? That's old enough to be learning Thou's old enough to be learning thy book a good bit now. I haven't any books, said Mary. Those I had were left in India. That's a pity, said Martha. If Mrs. Medlock let thee go into the library, there's thousands of books there. Mary did not ask where the library was because she was suddenly inspired by a new idea. She made up her mind to go out and find it herself. She was not troubled about Mrs. Medlock. Mrs. Medlock always seemed always to be in her comfortable housekeeper's sitting room downstairs. In this queer place, one scarcely ever saw anyone at all. In fact, there was no one to see but the servants, and when their master was away, they lived a luxurious life below stairs, where there was a huge kitchen hung about with shining brass and pewter, and a large servants' hall where there were 4 or 5 abundant meals eaten every day, and where a great deal of lively romping went on when Mrs. Medlock was out of the way. Mary's meals were served regularly, and Martha waited on her, but no one troubled themselves about her in the least. Mrs. Medlock came and looked at her every day or two, but no one inquired what she did or told her what to do. She supposed that perhaps this was the English way of treating children. In India, she had always been attended by her ayah, who had followed her about and waited on her hand and foot. She had often been tired of her company. Now she was followed by nobody and was learning to dress herself because Martha looked as though she thought she was silly and stupid when she wanted to have things handed to her to put on. Hasn't thou got good sense? She said once When Mary had stood waiting for her to put on her gloves for her, "Our Susan Anna's twice as sharp as thee, and she's only 4 years old. Sometimes I looks fair soft in the head." Mary had worn her contrary scowl for an hour after that, but it made her think several entirely new things. She stood at the window for about 10 minutes this morning, after Martha had swept up the hearth for the last time and gone downstairs. She was thinking over the new idea which had come to her when she heard of the library. Let's see how we're doing. Okay. Library. When she heard of the library. She did not care very much about the library itself because she had read very few books, but to hear of it brought back to her mind the 100 rooms with closed doors. She wondered if they were all really locked and what she would find if she could get into any of them. Were there 100 really? Why shouldn't she go and see how many doors she could count? It would be something to do on this morning when she could not go out. She had never been taught to ask permission to do things, and she knew nothing at all about authority, so she would not have thought it necessary to ask Mrs. Medlock if she might walk about the house, even if she had seen her. Love this. So pretty. Have to wash it by hand. Okay, she opened the door of the room and went into the corridor, and then she began her wanderings. It was a long corridor, and it branched into other corridors, and it led her up short flights of steps, which mounted to others again. There were doors and doors, and there were pictures on the walls. Sometimes there were pictures of dark, curious landscapes, but oftenest they were portraits of men and women in queer grand costumes made of satin and velvet. She found herself in one long gallery whose walls were covered with these portraits. She had never thought there could be so many in any house. She walked slowly down this place and stared at the faces, which also seemed to stare at her. She felt as if they were wondering what a little girl from India was doing in their house. Some were pictures of children, little girls in thick satin frocks which reached to their feet and stood out about them, and boys with puffed sleeves and lace collars and long hair, or with big ruffs around their necks. Ruffles. She always stopped to look at the children and wonder what their names were, and where they had gone, and why they wore such odd clothes. There was a stiff, plain little girl rather like herself. She wore a green brocade dress and held a green parrot on her finger. Her eyes had a sharp, curious look. "Where do you live now?" said Mary aloud to her. "I wish you were here." Surely no other little girl ever spent such a queer morning. It seemed as if there were no one in all the huge rambling house but her own small self. Stuff rolls around up there sometimes. It scares me. Let's see, rambling house but her own small self, wandering about upstairs and down, through narrow passages and wide ones, where it seemed to her that no one but herself had ever walked. Since so many rooms had been built, people must have lived in them, but it all seemed so empty that she could not quite believe it true. And we're going to stop right there. Bookmark, bookmark. Come on, bookmark. Oh, come on. There we go. Yay! Woo! Okay. I'm just trying to, I got the bookmark there, but I'm trying to, I can do that after I leave you guys. Okay, hope you're enjoying the book. One last look at the beautiful red, my beautiful corner. Loving this room. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for getting it started. And Hannah for helping, and all you people for providing the goodies. Appreciate scarf, earrings, all the stuff. Y'all are fabulous. Dabbing cloth. Granny's getting fancy. Woo! Okay. And remember to be looking out for a video this weekend about a 1K giveaway. Love you all. Mwah, to family and mwah, to friends. No new word on Andrea. I gave an update in the live today, so if you haven't checked that out, sorry again that it took the live so long, the live chat part to come up, but it's there now. And again, remember, don't wait on notifications. Just know that I will be live on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, 5 o'clock Eastern time. So whatever that is for you guys. If you want to set an alarm or whatever. And I wasn't meaning to be ugly about that. I was just, that's why I did it, because of the notifications. And I am totally sorry about that. But like I said, I don't seem to have a whole lot to do about it, or with it, or to it, or... Love y'all.